December 17th, 1944. Bulge, Belgium. The sky is a hard gray dome. Snow lies in drifts along the narrow road that runs between whitewashed houses and barns. It is still dark when the first Panther tanks roll into the village. Exhaust fumes hang low, leaving a metallic tang in the frozen air. Diesel and gasoline mix with the smell of pine from the stacks of cut wood piled against fences. The only sound is the clatter of steel tracks and the crunch of ice under boots. A German armored spearhead, Kampfgruppe of the 1st SS Panzer Division, moves like a column of shadows through the sleeping hamlet. Orders are whispered, not shouted. Frost forms on black SS uniforms. Men are tired, unshaven, their faces pinched by the cold. They have been awake for 2 days, fighting their way from the German frontier through the Losheim Gap and the abandoned village of Hansfeld. In that village, they found row upon row of American gasoline drums, 50,000 gallons in all. They forced American prisoners to refuel their thirsty tanks at gunpoint. Now they press westward, deeper into Allied lines. The offensive behind them is Hitler's last throw of the dice. The broader picture is staggering. Hitler has committed more than 410,000 troops, just over 400 tanks and armored fighting vehicles, and 600 guns to this counteroffensive. To reach the Meuse River and the port of Antwerp, they need fuel. The German High Command has almost 5 million gallons of fuel stockpiled for the offensive, but it lies far behind the front and cannot be moved forward quickly enough. Commanders are told to capture American supplies along the way to the German rank and file. This makes little sense. Tanks burn 40 liters an hour. They know the Wehrmacht's logistical network is thin. The Red Ball Express and Allied truck convoys have been a constant target for months. Snow falls heavily, muffling the roar of engines. Temperatures sink toward -20 degrees Celsius. By the end of December, soldiers will speak of -28 degrees. The offensive will stall on frozen roads, but that is in the future. In this moment, the landscape is a white labyrinth, the perfect staging ground for a surprise attack. The SS Panzer commander, 29-year-old Johann Paper, stands in his half-track scanning the horizon with binoculars. He knows that 50,000 gallons of fuel is a drop in the ocean, but he takes what he can. He is tasked with leading a vanguard toward the Meuse. He has roughly 5,000 men and 117 tanks and assault guns at the start of the offensive. His mission is clear: drive west, cross the Meuse, seize bridges, and open the way for the 6th Panzer Army. Hitler calls this plan Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine, but within German ranks some call it Unternehmen Gammelfleisch, the rotten meat operation. Many officers know the numbers. They remember Stalingrad. They know they are short of fuel and ammunition, and that Allied air power will return as soon as the weather clears. Yet the promise of a decisive victory lingers. In Bulge, Paper orders a brief halt. Men jump off tanks and run to the fuel depot. They pry open American fuel drums with knives, then attach hoses to feed Tiger and Panther tanks. At the same time, a quartermaster detail drags wooden crates from a snow-covered tent. Curious hands tear open the waxed cardboard boxes. Inside are American rations, neat packets of biscuits, processed meat, chocolate, cigarettes, chewing gum, instant coffee, and sugar cubes. German officers stare at the small comforts and realize that the enemy eats better under fire than they do at headquarters. The cold bites deeper. Their sense of foreboding grows. The Battle of the Bulge did not begin in Bulge. It began in conference rooms in Berlin months before. Hitler's generals warned him against a major offensive in the West. They told him the army lacked reserves, trucks, and fuel. They reminded him that Allied air superiority made maneuver risky in daylight, and that weather in the Ardennes was unpredictable. Hitler ignored them. He believed that one bold strike could split the Allies, capture Antwerp, and force Britain and the United States to negotiate. He assembled the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich and created several Kampfgruppen to spearhead the attack. The plan hinged on surprise and speed. This meant using secondary roads through the dense Ardennes forest. These roads were single-lane tracks, steep and icy. Paper himself said the route was not for tanks, but for bicycles. Nevertheless, he drove his heavy Panthers and Tigers into the woods. The stakes were impossible. German tanks and half-tracks could travel only as fast as fuel could be delivered to them. Each Tiger II consumed about 60 liters of fuel per hour. A Panther, slightly less. Even if the Germans reached Antwerp, they would still need to hold it and its approaches. That would require supplies they no longer possessed. The German High Command had stockpiled almost 5 million gallons of fuel for the operation, but the fuel was behind the Rhine and subject to Allied air interdiction. Rail lines had been smashed by bombers. Bridges had been destroyed. Horse-drawn wagons and thin fuel pipes could not keep up with a mechanized offensive. So planners told units like Papers to seize Allied fuel dumps along the way. They believed they could find what they needed on the other side of the line. This assumption turned soldiers into scavengers and fuel into the most valued commodity on the battlefield. Paper would make his men refuel at gunpoint. Later, he would try to float barrels down a river to them. German logistics compared poorly with the American system. By December 1944, the United States Army had constructed a vast supply network across Europe. The capture of Antwerp and the clearing of the Scheldt estuary allowed convoys of Liberty ships to unload thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations each day. Truck convoys known as the Red Ball Express and later follow-on operations moved supplies from French ports to the front. American soldiers were well-fed and well-equipped. K-rations illustrate this difference. Each ration provided 3 meals, breakfast, dinner, and supper, totaling 3,726 calories and weighing a little over 32 ounces. The boxes contained canned meat, biscuits, concentrated chocolate, powdered drink mixes, sugar, cigarettes, and chewing gum. They were designed for airborne troops and for troops on the march. In 1944 alone, U.S. manufacturers produced more than 105 million K-rations. German soldiers had nothing comparable. Their daily ration had been cut in half. By late 1944, many units relied on captured Soviet food or subsisted on watery soup. Cigarettes were scarce. Chocolate was a luxury reserved for officers. When German officers opened the American ration boxes in Bulingen, they were shocked. A day's worth of food for one U.S. soldier contained more calories and variety than a week's ration for a German soldier at the front. The capture of fuel at Hansfeld and Bulingen looked like a windfall, but it highlighted the problem. Paper's men found 50,000 gallons of gasoline. They forced American prisoners from the Quartermaster Company to refuel their tanks. They loaded as many 5-gallon jerry cans as they could carry. Yet they also found crates of K-rations stacked neatly in supply depots. Hungry soldiers tore open the boxes. They passed around cigarettes, chewing gum, and tins of processed meat. Some laughed at the little booklets of instructions that came with each meal. Break fast, dinner, supper. The idea of planned meals seemed absurd. Others pocketed chocolate bars and sugar cubes for later. Officers took note of the industrial efficiency represented by the packaging. Boxes sealed in waxed paper, each marked with an expiry date and a lot number. They realized that the enemy could produce millions of these boxes without a second thought. On the German side, supply officers had to organize ersatz, replacement rations, to stretch diminishing stocks. A captured ration was a symbol of an economy able to feed an army anywhere in the world. The Germans were also short of medicine. They had few anesthetics, no penicillin, and limited bandage supplies. Major Hal McCown, the captured commander of the U.S. 2nd Battalion, 119th Infantry Regiment, later described the German aid station at La Gleize. He saw doctors amputating limbs with little more than morphine and saw doctors go without proper surgical tools. Meanwhile, American field hospitals in the rear had plasma, sulfa drugs, sterile instruments, and heated tents. The discrepancy was not merely one of comfort. It directly affected combat effectiveness. Wounded German soldiers died in barns and basements. Wounded Americans had a chance at recovery. The plan, therefore, was doomed. The Germans were attacking with a force roughly equal in size to those they faced, yet they lacked depth, reserves, and the ability to sustain momentum. American divisions could fall back, reorganize, and counterattack because they were supplied. German divisions could not. In the north, near Monshaw and Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions and detached artillery fought stubbornly. They used their superiority in artillery and coordination to hold the line. According to the U.S. Army's account, German assault units, like Papers, faced well-coordinated American barges that delayed and disorganized them. Every hour lost to a roadblock or minefield burnt precious fuel. The more fuel burnt, the more the entire plan faltered. The stark contrast in conditions extended beyond supplies. In the U.S. Army, soldiers rotated through rest areas and had regular meal and hot meals. In December, the 101st Airborne was resting near Montmelon when called to Bastogne. They were hungry and tired, but their morale remained high because they knew supplies would catch up. German soldiers seldom received leave and often marched hundreds of kilometers between fronts. Hitler demanded total commitment. He told his commanders the offensive would break the Allies. Many frontline officers were skeptical but dared not voice their doubts. The sense of desperation hung in the air. When American rations were opened in Bulingen, that desperation deepened. Officers realized they were not fighting on equal terms. They were playing a game of chance with no cards. The K-ration boxes were tangible proof that the United States could put its industrial might into something as mundane as a meal. For some German officers, it was the first time they truly understood what industrial war meant. After the stop in Bullingen, Paper turned his column south to Lignaville and then west toward Stavelot. The roads narrowed to tracks between hedges. Snow continued to fall. Paper moved quickly, leaving the massacred remains of prisoners behind at Bognes. He expected to cross the Amblev River at Stavelot and capture fuel depots on the far side. His intelligence officers had learned that two Allied fuel depots, designated number 2 and number 3, lay between Spa and Stavelot and contained more than 3 million gallons of gasoline. Seizing those depots would provide fuel for the dash to the Meuse. But Stavelot was defended. In the pre-dawn hours of December 18th, American engineers of the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion blew bridges and set up roadblocks along the Amblev. Units from the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion took positions near the Stavelot Bridge. Captain Charles Mitchell's company established a roadblock on the Vieux-Château Road. The Americans had little armor, but they had bazookas and determination. When Paper's advance elements approached the bridge, they found it defended and mined. German sappers tried to push forward, but came under fire. A flare lit up the scene. Half-tracks from the 825th were destroyed by crossfire. The Germans eventually seized the eastern end of the bridge by sheer weight of fire, but the delay cost them hours. Meanwhile, American troops hauled away fuel drums from Depot Number 3 and pumped them into trucks. When it became clear that they could not move the entire stockpile, engineers poured gasoline on the ground and set it alight. Pillars of black smoke rose into the cold air. The Germans arrived to find flames and empty drums. More than 3 million gallons of gasoline that could have powered the German offensive burned or were evacuated by the Allies. The fighting at Stavelot and the nearby village of Frankerchamps devolved into a series of brutal skirmishes. American infantry fired from upstairs windows. German panzer grenadiers kicked in doors and threw grenades down cellar stairs. Civilians huddled in basements. The Amblev River was icy. Some American soldiers escaped by breaking the ice and swimming across. At one point, German tanks attempted to ford the river, but the current and steep banks proved too difficult. The road network in Stavelot was a maze. Vehicles jammed on narrow streets. German fuel trucks could not squeeze through. The battle cost time and fuel. Each Tiger left idling in the cold drained its tanks. Paper's frustration grew. He radioed headquarters asking for engineers and bridging equipment. They were tied up elsewhere. As the day wore on, a bigger problem loomed. The weather was starting to clear. The overcast that had protected the German advance began to break. By noon of December 18th, patches of blue sky appeared. Allied aircraft would soon be able to fly. Paper understood that once P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings could see his column, the road ahead would become a death trap. He had to move. Yet his panzers were sucking their tanks dry. Drivers reported half-empty fuel gauges. The captured fuel from Hansfeld and Bullingen was nearly gone. Paper ordered the roadblock cleared at all costs. Assault guns shelled the buildings on the western bank. Grenadiers stormed across the bridge. The defenders were pushed back, but not destroyed. They regrouped outside the town and continued to harass the German column with mortars and small arms. During the attack, German troops discovered that they were fighting near a treasure they could not see. Depot Number 2, less than half a kilometer from the road, held over 2 million gallons of fuel. According to American after-action reports, many German vehicles passed within 300 yards of the depot without realizing it. The facility was hidden in a wooded ravine with a narrow entrance. The camouflage and the smoke of burning drums concealed it. German reconnaissance had failed to identify it. Paper later called missing that depot the worst thing that could have happened. The mistake underscored the weakness of German intelligence. They lacked adequate aerial reconnaissance. They were moving too quickly to conduct detailed searches. The road network allowed only a single route. Straying from it risked bogging down in mud or snow. Ironically, the American engineers defending Stavelot were protecting more fuel than Paper could have imagined. The defenders did not know the full extent of what they were guarding either. They simply followed orders to hold the bridge. The shortage of fuel was not the only crisis. Ammunition was also scarce. The German assault guns carried limited high-explosive rounds. Tank crews rationed their shells. Machine gunners counted bullets. Once the offensive lost momentum, resupply became nearly impossible. Air resupply was attempted on the night of December 22nd. Planes dropped canisters, but 90% fell outside German lines. German soldiers risked their lives crawling out to retrieve them under American fire. Few returned. An even more desperate scheme called for floating fuel drums down the Amblev River to La Gleize. Drums were rolled into the freezing water, but they broke open or drifted away. The attempts highlight how dire the situation had become. Paper's men were surrounded by fuel they could not use and supplies they could not reach. They were freezing, hungry, and under constant shelling. Casualties mounted. In Stavelot, Sergeant Armstrong's half-track was hit and burst into flames. Crew members burned. Another soldier, Anthony Calvanese, was shot in the leg and later the ankle. He took refuge in a Belgian dairy and was hidden by civilians. On both sides, the wounded were trapped in cellars and barns. American artillery pounded the town incessantly. German doctors' kits were empty. They could not properly treat wounds. The cold worsened the suffering. Frostbite spread among soldiers who had lost gloves or boots. Rifles jammed as lubrication froze. Field telephones shorted out. Yet orders kept coming. Push forward. Capture fuel. Reach the Meuse. The logic of the orders was swallowed by the reality on the ground. In this phase of the battle, logistics became more important than firepower. Each hour, each mile drained resources. The German army's tactical proficiency could not overcome its logistical weakness. American supply lines were stretched but intact. They brought forward ammunition, fuel, and food despite German attacks. Engineers rebuilt bridges as quickly as the Germans blew them. At Bastogne, cargo planes dropped bundles of ammunition and rations even under fire. Airdrops coordinated by signal panels and flares. Meanwhile, Paper's tanks sputtered and stalled. When he finally broke through Stavelot and reached the outskirts of Stillmont on December 19th, his spearhead had shrunk. He had fewer than 20 tanks with fuel and operational condition. They continued west toward La Gleize, but each engagement whittled them down. The German blitz had slowed to a crawl. Every time a tank engine coughed, someone looked back at the burning fuel depots and cursed missed opportunities. War is not only fuel and steel. It is men making decisions under pressure, feeling cold, fear, and responsibility. The meeting between Johan Paper and Major Hal McCown reveals the human factor behind the mechanical struggle. McCown commanded the 2nd Battalion, 119th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. On December 21st, his battalion defended Stillmont when Paper's panzers attacked. After a day of heavy fighting, McCown was ordered to withdraw. In the confusion, he and several officers were captured. They were marched to La Gleize and brought before Paper. McCown later wrote about the encounter. He described Paper as confident and charismatic. Despite exhaustion, Paper appeared poised, wearing a black SS uniform with the collar patch of the Leibstandard. McCown was surprised at his good English. They spoke for 6 hours. Paper boasted about the quality of his men and spoke at length about new divisions he said were forming under Heinrich Himmler. He mentioned secret weapons like the V1 and V2 and claimed more were coming. McCown, aware of Allied superiority, listened politely. He observed that Paper had no idea of the true scale of American industry. He saw that the German officer believed that bravery and new weapons could compensate for shortages. McCown tried to explain that the American arsenal was inexhaustible. Paper did not believe him. During their conversation, American artillery hammered La Gleize. Explosions shook the cellar where they sat. McCown saw a German soldier thrown across the room by a shell burst. An American lieutenant was killed by shrapnel. Several Germans were wounded. McCown and his fellow prisoners administered first aid. There were no proper bandages. They tore up shirts to stanch bleeding. Even the guards took shelter in the cellar. The meeting continued between shell bursts. The contrast between Paper's grandiose claims and the reality around him could not have been starker. McCown later wrote that Paper impressed him as a man who would do anything for his Führer, but was also a soldier trapped by circumstances. He was educated, had served on Himmler's staff, and had commanded Tigers in Italy. He was also leading men to their deaths with little chance of success. The human element extended beyond officers. German troops were cold and hungry. Many wore captured American winter jackets over their SS uniforms, the white star emblazoned on their backs. Some carried K rations they had taken from depots. They smoked American cigarettes and drank the powdered coffee. They had not seen such food for months. Private diaries recovered after the war show that many were amazed by the abundance. One soldier wrote that he had eaten an entire ration box in a single sitting, savoring the chocolate, the cheese spread, and the chewing gum. He wrote that he felt guilty enjoying the enemy's food while his own family starved in Cologne. Another wrote that the cigarette ration alone was worth fighting for. The psychological impact of the K rations cannot be overstated. They were physical proof of American wealth and industrial capacity. Many German officers had studied U.S. production statistics but seeing the rations made the numbers real. They understood that each U.S. division received thousands of these boxes every week. The notion of winning through supply rather than heroic charges was alien to them. German doctrine emphasized Kampfgeist, fighting spirit, and close combat. Paper believed in this, yet his men were being destroyed by lack of fuel and American artillery rather than by hand-to-hand fighting. American soldiers showed a different attitude. Many were combat veterans of Normandy and the Hürtgen Forest. They were used to hardship, but they trusted their supply system. They grumbled about K-rations. They joked about the monotony of the canned meat and the hardness of the biscuits. Yet they appreciated the cigarettes and chocolate. In foxholes around Stavelot and La Gleize, GIs shared rations with each other and with Belgian civilians. They gave candy bars to children and traded cigarettes for eggs. These small acts of generosity contrasted with the desperation of the German troops. When McCown was held in the cellar with other prisoners, he and his men were treated correctly for the most part. The Germans shared bread and whatever coffee they had. There were moments of humanity. German guards talked about their families. McCown learned that some of them had lost relatives in Allied bombings. The war had touched everyone. Cultural differences were evident. American soldiers believed in rotation. They expected to go home after the war. German soldiers were committed to total war. Desertion meant death. The SS units had been indoctrinated and often acted brutally, as seen at Bognes. Yet within La Gleize, there were acts of mercy. When the bombardment collapsed houses, German soldiers helped rescue Belgian civilians from cellars. They shared the cold with them. In one cellar, 22 civilians spent 6 days alongside German soldiers and American prisoners. Everyone endured the same fear. The human factor prevented the war from becoming a purely mechanical exercise. As days passed, morale in Kampfgruppe Paper eroded. Paper tried to maintain discipline. He organized ration distribution and promised that supplies would arrive. He visited tank crews, praising them for their courage. He told them they would break out. In his private notes, he worried. He wrote that he could not get food or ammunition. He complained about the lack of air support. He argued with higher headquarters by radio. They told him to hold. He replied he needed fuel. They offered promises. He received none. McCown and other prisoners listened to these conversations and realized that the German commander was desperate. The human factor here was hope. Paper's hope became less rational each day. His men saw it. They started to question orders. When word spread that the fuel depots near Stavelot had contained millions of gallons, some cursed their bad luck. Others wondered why intelligence had failed them. Faith in leadership cracked. At the same time, American morale improved. Patton's Third Army was racing north. Parachute drops brought supplies to Bastogne. The tide was turning. By December, 22nd Kampfgruppe Paper was encircled in La Gleize. American forces from the 30th Infantry Division and the 3rd Armored Division had cut the N33 road north of Trois-Ponts. Elements of the 82nd Airborne attacked Chenouse, while other American units pressed in from the west and north. The Amblev River protected the southern flank. The village, perched on a hill, became a cauldron. American artillery and mortars bombarded it around the clock. Houses were reduced to rubble. Civilians hid in cellars. Over 170 American prisoners were held under guard. The German aid station lacked anesthetics and drugs. Only essential amputations were possible. Food was running low. Fuel was almost gone. Of the original 117 tanks and assault guns, perhaps 24 remained operational. Many lacked fuel to move. Paper requested airdrops. 90% of the canisters fell outside the perimeter. Attempts to float fuel down the river failed. He sent runners to headquarters asking for relief. None came. Paper held a conference with his company commanders in a cellar. He told them the situation was untenable. He asked for suggestions. Some proposed breaking out to the east across the Amblev, using the ruined bridge at Stavelot. Others suggested moving south across open fields. None of these options were realistic. American forces were on all roads. Artillery could turn open ground into killing zones. Paper decided to wait for nightfall and then abandon the vehicles. It was a painful decision for a tank commander. The Tiger II at La Gleize, number 213, was one of the most powerful tanks in the world. Crews had nurtured it like a pet, cleaning and maintaining it even under fire. Now they would have to destroy it. Men poured fuel over engines and ammunition racks. They placed charges. Around 2 o'clock on December 24th, Paper's men began to move. They destroyed heavy equipment and disabled guns. They left wounded who could not travel. Some prisoners were left behind as well. Others were marched with the column. A handful of vehicles that still had fuel and could navigate the roads were used to transport the seriously wounded. The rest went on foot. The night march was harrowing. Men moved silently through the dark, carrying rifles, ammunition belts, and rucksacks. They wore cloth wrapped around boots to muffle footsteps. Snow fell again. Temperatures dropped. The ground was icy. Men slipped and fell. They avoided open fields and followed forest paths. They feared American patrols. Occasionally they heard the bark of a rifle or the rattle of a machine gun and hit the ground. Moonlight reflected off the snow, casting a ghostly light. The column strung out over miles. Paper walked with his men. He encouraged them, telling them German lines were near. In fact, the nearest friendly unit was several kilometers away across rugged terrain. American units were patrolling. The column zigzagged, using local guides and captured maps. They crossed the Liane Valley and climbed slopes. At one point they followed a stream, walking through icy water to avoid leaving tracks. The frost bit their feet. Men with frostbite cried silently, but kept moving. They had no choice. Behind them log leaves burned. Flames from exploding ammunition lit the sky. By dawn the column reached friendly lines near Wan and Hoshifin. About 800 unwounded men made it out. They were starving and exhausted. They had abandoned all heavy weapons. They had left behind 135 tanks, assault guns, half-tracks, and artillery pieces. Among these was the Tiger II that was later shipped to the United States. The equipment loss was catastrophic. For the rest of the war, the Leibstandard never recovered its strength. German High Command tried to spin the breakout as a tactical withdrawal. In truth, it was a disorganized retreat. German casualties numbered in the thousands. Many wounded and prisoners in Log-Lees were later liberated by American troops. Major McCown survived. He wrote about the poor state of German supplies and the bravery of individual soldiers on both sides. The collapse of Kampfgruppe paper was emblematic of the larger failure of the Ardennes offensive. Hitler's plan had been based on the premise of speed and surprise. It achieved tactical surprise, but logistics did not allow speed. The road network, the weather, and Allied resistance slowed the German advance. Each delay burned fuel and allowed Allied forces to react. Once the weather cleared, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. The 405th Fighter Group and others strafed and bombed German columns. Bridges were blown. Convoys were trapped and destroyed. The German High Command could not push supplies forward. 5 million gallons of fuel sat useless behind the Rhine. Paper's 50,000 gallons looked even more paltry. When the spearhead failed, the entire offensive lost its momentum. Other German corps also encountered stubborn resistance at Elsenborn Ridge and Bastogne. Without fuel, none could exploit breakthroughs. By early January, the German army in the west was back on the defensive. The last reserves had been spent. The Ardennes offensive cost Germany more than 67,000 casualties and most of its remaining armor. It gained little territory and failed to achieve any strategic objective. For the men of Kampfgruppe paper, the march out of Log-Lees was a march into history. They had seen the inside of American rations and the inside of their own logistical failure. They had fought bravely, but bravery did not move tanks without fuel. After the battle, American logisticians examined the field. They found burnt-out Tigers and Panthers, destroyed half-tracks, and shattered artillery pieces. They counted the fuel drums at Hansfeld and the remains of the depots at Stavelot. They saw how close paper had come to capturing the 3 million gallons of gasoline. They marveled that he had missed them by a few hundred yards. They concluded that better German reconnaissance might have extended the offensive by days. But they also noted that even 3 million gallons would not have been enough. German consumption rates and the distance to the Meuse meant that more fuel would have been required. The Allied supply system could deliver that amount daily when ports and pipelines were open. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps delivered millions of gallons of fuel, along with millions of K rations, to the front every month. Each American infantry division consumed around 600 tons of supplies per day. The Red Ball Express alone moved 12,500 tons a day in the late summer of 1944. By December, the port of Antwerp handled 100,000 tons per week. Such numbers dwarfed the German efforts. Where the Germans had to conserve every drop, Americans could flood the battlefield with material. Historians have emphasized the logistical lessons of the Ardennes. Charles MacDonald, an officer who fought in the battle, later wrote that the German failure was less about courage and more about fuel and roads. He noted that the 99th and 2nd Divisions held because their artillery was supplied and their communications intact. Others point to the role of weather and intelligence. The German plan relied on poor visibility to neutralize Allied air power. This worked for 2 days, but once the sky cleared, the Luftwaffe could not contest control. Allied aircraft destroyed convoys and bridges. German intelligence failed to detect the fuel depots they needed most. They also underestimated the resilience of American soldiers. In the North, small units like those of the 291st Engineers and the 526th Armored Infantry fought roadblock actions that slowed the entire offensive. In the South, the 101st Airborne held Bastogne. These actions bought time for Patton's Third Army to turn north and relieve the pocket. Logistics made those responses possible. Radios worked, roads were plowed, fuel was available. The human stories endure. Major McCown survived captivity and later wrote about the respect he had for Paper's professionalism, even as he condemned SS atrocities. He acknowledged that Paper's men fought hard but were beaten by material factors. German soldiers who survived La Gleize returned home to a devastated Reich. Many later testified that opening the American rations at Bullingen had been a revelation. One recalled thinking, "If this is what one American soldier eats in a day, how can we ever beat them?" Others remember the smell of coffee and the taste of real chocolate in a landscape of hunger. Those small details symbolize the industrial might of the United States. They also humanized the enemy in the eyes of German soldiers. They realized that their foe was well-fed, well-supplied, and determined. For the Americans, the battle reinforced the importance of logistics. General George C. Marshall and General Dwight Eisenhower had insisted on building a robust supply chain long before D-Day. They endured criticism for emphasizing depots, trucks, and pipelines over additional divisions. The Ardennes validated their decisions. Without stockpiles of fuel and food, the sudden German offensive might have pushed the Allies back to the Seine. Without millions of K-rations, American soldiers would have gone hungry in the snow. Without engineers and quartermasters, there would have been no replacements for lost bridges or burnt tanks. War is not won by courage alone. It is won by men who drive trucks, unload ships, repair roads, and pack rations. It is won by planning and by the industrial workers thousands of kilometers from the front. In the Ardennes, the United States proved that logistical depth could absorb the heaviest blow the enemy could muster and respond with overwhelming force. The final lesson is sobering. The German soldiers who opened the K-rations in Bullingen understood that they were fighting a superpower. They saw the tiny booklets listing menus and the cigarettes and candy bars intended to sustain a man through a long day. They realized that behind each U.S. regiment stood a nation able to produce and transport anything in unimaginable quantities. No amount of bravery or tactical brilliance could overcome that. When Kampfgruppe Paper disappeared into the snows of the Ardennes, leaving behind its tanks and wounded, the myth of German invincibility vanished with it. What remained was a recognition that wars are decided not by mythical wonder weapons, but by logistics, industry, and the ability to feed and fuel armies across continents. In the end, the Ardennes offensive failed. Germany expended its last reserves for no strategic gain. The Allies resumed their advance, and within 4 months crossed the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered for heroism on both sides, for atrocities, and for suffering in the snow. But it should also be remembered for what German officers realized when they opened American K-rations on that cold morning. Wars aren't won by steel alone. They are won by the men who keep the fuel and food flowing. That quiet revelation, in a Belgian village buried under snow, signaled the end of the Third Reich's last hope.